She thought she'd won when the tow truck pulled away with my Honda. Karen Whitmore stood on her perfect suburban lawn, arms crossed, watching 23 years of my life disappear around the corner. But what she didn't know, what none of us knew, was that her pristine white Range Rover was bleeding transmission fluid into the storm drain, drop by toxic drop. And in this neighborhood, with these rules, with this homeowners association, she ran like her personal kingdom. Sometimes, karma doesn't just knock. 2 weeks and 3 days when Karen Whitmore decided to destroy his life. Not that he was counting. The house had been his grandmother's, a small, honey-colored ranch with window boxes that Nine-Eye had tended religiously until the stroke took her words, then her movement, then finally her breath. The inheritance had been a blessing and a curse. A blessing because Marcus, a 28-year-old graphic designer, barely scraping by in his downtown studio apartment, suddenly owned property. A curse because Maple Grove Estates wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a lifestyle, complete with covenants, restrictions, and a homeowners association president who treated every blade of grass like a personal affront to her authority. Karen Whitmore lived in the Colonial across the street, the kind of house that belonged in a magazine spread about successful suburban families. 2-story brick facade, perfectly manicured lawn, circular driveway that housed her gleaming white Range Rover like a throne room display. She was 42, but looked older, the kind of woman who wore her stress in the tight lines around her eyes and the way she held her shoulders like she was always bracing for a fight. She'd introduced herself on Marcus's first day with a clipboard. "Welcome to Maple Grove," she'd said, standing at his front door in a crisp white blouse and khaki slacks that looked like they'd been pressed that morning. "I'm Karen Whitmore, HOA president," I thought. "I'd bring you the community guidelines." The guidelines had been a 47-page document that read like a legal contract. No vehicles parked on the street overnight. No lawn ornaments exceeding 12 inches in height. No exterior modifications without written approval from the... Marcus would later learn, had never voted against her on anything. "Your grandmother was a lovely woman," Karen had continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "She understood the importance of maintaining property values. I trust you'll continue that tradition." But he'd been dealing with his grandmother's medical bills, the probate process, and trying to figure out how to afford the property taxes on a house worth 3 times his annual salary. A neighborhood busybody seemed like a manageable problem. He'd been wrong. The first violation notice arrived 2 weeks later, printed on official HOA letterhead and delivered to his mailbox with the formality of a court summons. Failure to remedy within 72 hours or face fines. Marcus had stood in his driveway, holding the notice, staring at grass that looked perfectly normal to him. Across the street, Karen's lawn looked like it had been cut with scissors and measured with a ruler. Every blade was uniform, every edge sharp enough to cut glass. He'd bought a lawnmower that weekend, used Honda push mower from Craigslist that coughed black smoke but got the job done. The next notice came 3 days later. Lawnmower stored in front yard visible from street. Relocate to rear yard. Or enclosed garage immediately. The problem was, Marcus didn't have a garage. Nine-Eye had converted the garage into a studio apartment years ago, which she'd rented out to help pay for her medications. The tenant, an elderly man named Frank, who worked nights at the hospital, had been living there for 5 years. Marcus couldn't exactly kick him out to make room for a lawnmower. He'd moved the mower to the side yard, behind a privacy fence that blocked it from street view. The next notice cited inappropriate storage of equipment in side yard without architectural approval. That's when Marcus began to understand that this wasn't about lawn care or property values. This was about control. Karen Whitmore had been HOA president for 8 years. She'd run unopposed for the last 3 elections, partly because most residents just wanted to live their lives without getting involved in neighborhood politics, and partly because the few who'd tried to challenge her had been driven out through citations, fines, and legal action. Mrs. Rodriguez at the end of the street had moved after racking up $2,000 in fines for an unapproved garden gnome, their shutters the same color they'd been for 20 years. Karen had a system, and it was brutally effective. Marcus tried to comply. He measured his grass with a ruler every few days. He submitted architectural review requests for things as minor as replacing his mailbox numbers. He attended HOA meetings where Karen sat at the head of a folding table in the community center, wielding her gavel like a weapon. But compliance wasn't enough. Karen wanted submission, and Marcus had never been good at submitting. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Marcus had been working late the night before, finishing a logo design for a client who'd demanded 17 revisions and still wasn't happy. His 2015 Honda Civic Reliable, but far from pristines, sat in his driveway where it had been parked. He was pouring coffee when he heard the knock. Karen stood on his porch, clipboard in hand, flanked by two other women he recognized from HOA meetings. Janet Morrison, the secretary, was a thin woman with nervous energy who always seemed to be taking notes. Beth Cho, no relation, despite the name, was the treasurer, a quiet woman who rarely spoke but always voted with Karen. "We need to discuss your vehicle." Marcus looked past her to his Honda, then back at her face. "What about it? It's been parked in the same spot for over a week. According to the covenants, any vehicle that remains stationary for more than 5 days without being moved is considered abandoned." Karen's smile was sharp as a blade. "The covenants are quite clear. Section 4.7 states that no abandoned or inoperable vehicles may be stored on the property. Your vehicle hasn't moved in 8 days. Marcus felt his temper rising. "I work from home. I don't drive every day. That doesn't make my car abandoned." "The covenants don't distinguish between abandoned and unused," Janet chimed in, consulting her notes. "Any vehicle that remains stationary for more than 5 days falls under the abandoned vehicle policy." "This is ridiculous," Marcus said. "My car is registered, insured, and in perfect working order. It's parked in my own driveway. The covenants supersede personal preference. Mr. Chen, you have 24 hours to move the vehicle, or it will be reported to the city as abandoned and subject to towing." "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about maintaining community standards," Karen replied. 24 hours. She turned and walked away, her small entourage following like attendants to a queen. Marcus watched them go, his coffee growing cold in his hands, and felt something dark and angry settling in his chest. He could have moved the car. Should have moved the car. But principle was a stubborn thing, and Marcus had reached his limit with Karen Whitmore's petty tyranny. 26 hours later, he watched from his kitchen window as the tow truck turned onto Maple Grove Drive. The driver was a big man, with calloused hands and a face that suggested he'd seen every type of neighborhood drama imaginable. He looked at the Honda, then at the paperwork Karen had provided, then at Marcus, who'd come out to stand in his driveway. "This your car?" the driver asked. "Yes. It look abandoned to you?" Marcus almost smiled. "No, it looks like a car parked in its owner's driveway." The driver shrugged. "The lady says it's been here over a week without moving. Says it's abandoned according to your HOA rules." "The lady says a lot of things." "That may be, but I got a work order. You want to move it? Now's the time." Marcus looked across the street. Karen stood in her front window, arms crossed, watching the drama unfold. He could see the satisfaction on her face, the way she held herself, like someone who'd just won a particularly satisfying victory. "Go ahead, Marcus," said Take It. The driver looked surprised. "You sure? It's going to cost you 300 plus storage fees to get it back." "I'm sure." As the Honda was winched onto the flatbed, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. Karen's pristine Range Rover sat in its usual spot in her circular driveway, but there was something wrong with the pavement beneath it. A dark stain spread from under the vehicle, creating a small puddle that reflected the afternoon sun. Oil, Marcus thought at first. Then he looked closer and saw the reddish tint that meant transmission fluid. The tow truck rumble. Marcus spent the next 3 days documenting Karen's Range Rover like a forensic investigator building a murder case. He photographed the transmission fluid stain from every angle, measured its spread with a tape measure, and noted the exact time each new drop fell. The leak was getting worse. What had started as a small puddle was now a slick patch of reddish fluid that stretched nearly to the curb. More importantly, it was flowing directly toward the storm drain. Section 6.3 of the HOA covenants was crystal clear about environmental violations. Marcus had read it so many times he could recite it from memory. Through months of harassment, he researched everything. The city's environmental protection ordinances were even stricter than the HOA rules. automotive fluid contamination of storm drains carried fines starting at $1,000 for first offenses, mandatory environmental remediation that could cost thousands. Karen had made one crucial error in her systematic campaign against Marcus. She'd shown him exactly how to wage war using bureaucracy as a weapon. On Thursday morning, Marcus watched from his kitchen window as Karen emerged from her house in her usual uniform of pressed khakis and a crisp blouse. She walked to her Range Rover with the confident stride of someone who'd never faced consequences. For her actions, the vehicle started with a low purr, and as she backed out of the driveway, Marcus could see fresh transmission fluid dripping onto the pristine asphalt. Walked across the street with his camera and measuring tape. In broad daylight, the evidence was even more damning. The stain had spread to cover nearly 20 square feet, and the fluid was clearly flowing toward the storm drain. He could smell the sharp chemical odor of transmission fluid from 5 feet away. He took dozens of photographs documenting the spill from every angle. Then he followed the flow pattern to the storm drain, where reddish residue had already begun to stain the concrete. According to the city's environmental protection guidelines, Karen Whitmore was in violation of at least 3 separate ordinances. Marcus returned to his house and began drafting his complaint. He'd learned from Karen that the key to effective bureaucratic warfare was documentation, specificity, and relentless follow-through. His report was a masterpiece of precision, complete with photographs, measurements, and citations of the relevant code sections. He filed complaints with the city's Environmental Protection Office, the County Health Department, and the HOA Architectural Review Committee. Then he sat back and waited for the machinery of bureaucracy to grind into motion. First response came from the city on Friday afternoon. Environmental Protection Officer Sarah Martinez called Marcus personally to discuss his complaint. "Mr. Chen, we've reviewed your documentation regarding the automotive fluid contamination on Maple Grove Drive, the authority of someone who took environmental violations seriously. This appears to be a significant spill that poses a risk to the stormwater system. We'll be conducting an inspection first thing Monday morning." "What kind of inspection?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer would be exactly what Karen deserved: full environmental assessment. "We'll need to test the fluid, document the contamination, and potentially require immediate remediation. If the violation is confirmed, we'll be issuing citations and fines." Marcus felt a warm satisfaction spreading through his chest. And if the property owner refuses to comply, then the fines escalate daily until compliance is achieved. Water system feeds directly into the regional watershed. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made suburbia look like a movie set. Marcus positioned himself at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the show unfold. At 8:30 a.m., followed by a county vehicle and what appeared to be a private contractor's van. 3 officials in official-looking uniforms emerged and began setting up equipment in Karen's driveway. Sarah Martinez was a woman in her 30s with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years dealing with environmental disasters. She directed her team with military precision, pointing out the contamination area and explaining the testing procedures. Karen emerged from her house at 8:45, clearly caught off guard by the invasion of her perfect driveway. She was dressed for work in a navy suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly salary. But her usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying across the street. "What's going on here?" Sarah approached. "I'm Officer Martinez with the city's Environmental Protection Office. We're here to investigate reports of automotive fluid contamination on your property." Marcus couldn't hear Karen's response, but he could see her posture change. The ramrod's straight shoulders sagged slightly, and she began gesturing at her Range Rover with the kind of frantic energy that suggested she was trying to explain something complicated very quickly. The inspection took 2 hours. The team tested the fluid, measured the contamination area, and documented everything with the same obsessive attention to detail that Karen had used in her HOA enforcement. They took photographs, collected samples, and filled out forms with the bureaucratic precision of people who knew their work would likely end up in court. Marcus watched Karen pace in her driveway like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear as she made what were probably increasingly desperate calls to mechanics, lawyers, or anyone who might be able to make this problem disappear. Sarah Martinez knocked on Marcus's door. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to thank you for the thorough documentation you provided. Your complaint was extremely helpful in our investigation. Were you able to confirm the violation? Sarah's smile was grim. Multiple violations. The contamination is significant, and it's been ongoing for at least several weeks. Based on the staining patterns, Mrs. Whitmore is looking at immediate remediation requirements and substantial fines. How substantial? Initial citation is $1,000 for improper disposal of automotive fluids. Daily fines of $500 until the contamination is remediated, which typically runs between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on the extent of the damage. Marcus tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside, he was celebrating. Karen had spent months making his life miserable over grass height and lawnmower placement, and now she was facing thousands of dollars in fines and cleanup costs. The contamination has reached the storm drain, which means it's now a county-level environmental incident. They'll be conducting their own investigation and potentially filing additional charges. As if on cue, another official vehicle pulled up to Karen's house. This one had County Environmental Services emblazoned on the side in bold letters. Marcus watched through his window as Karen's day went from bad to catastrophic. The county inspector was a tall man with the demeanor of someone who'd seen every type of environmental disaster imaginable. He spent 30 minutes examining the contamination, then another 30 minutes explaining something to Karen that made her face go progressively paler. Yellow caution tape marked off the contaminated area, and several environmental hazard signs had been posted around the spill. A specialized cleanup crew was scheduled to arrive that afternoon, and Karen's beloved Range Rover had been moved to the street ironically, the same street parking that she'd used to justify having Marcus's car towed. That evening, Marcus found the notice in his mailbox, printed on the same official letterhead that Karen had used to harass him for months. But this time, the recipient was Mrs. Karen Whitmore of 248 Maple Grove Drive. Violation notice: improper storage and disposal of hazardous materials on residential property. Failure to maintain property in accordance with environmental protection standards. Immediate remediation required. Is achieved. Marcus had to read it twice to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Karen Whitmore, the queen of HOA enforcement, was being cited by her own organization for the very type of violation she'd spent years documenting in others. At 6 p.m., Marcus heard the rumble of a diesel engine. Turning onto Maple Grove Drive, he looked out his window and saw a sight that made him laugh out loud: a city tow truck, approaching Karen's house with purposeful determination and a face that had seen every type of neighborhood drama. He pulled up next to Karen's Range Rover, which was now parked on the street in clear violation of the HOA's overnight parking restrictions. Karen came running out of her house, still in her work clothes but with her hair disheveled and her makeup smudged. She looked like a woman who'd spent the day fighting a losing battle against. Karen Whitmore had never been defeated at anything in her 42 years of existence. Not when she'd clawed her way to the top of her marketing firm. Not when she'd bulldozed through 3 different HOA boards to seize control of Maple Grove Estates. And certainly not when she'd systematically eliminated every neighbor who dared to challenge her authority. But Marcus Chen had just cost her $8,000 in environmental fines and cleanup costs, plus another $300 to get her Range Rover out of impound. The humiliation of watching her pristine SUV being towed away while her neighbors gathered to witness her downfall was a wound that would fester for years. If Marcus thought she was going to retreat quietly into suburban obscurity, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. Karen spent the weekend in her home office, surrounded by binders full of HOA documents, city ordinances, and legal precedents. She'd built her reputation on knowing every rule, every loophole, every pressure point that could be exploited to break down resistance. Marcus had won one battle, but Karen was preparing for total war. Monday morning, she began her counterattack. The first violation notice arrived at Marcus's house at 8 a.m., delivered by certified mail. Failure to maintain front yard landscaping to community standards. Grass height exceeds 2.5 inches in multiple areas. Immediate remediation required or face daily fines of $50. Marcus read the notice while standing in his driveway, then looked at his lawn. He'd mowed it 3 days ago. The grass was uniform, healthy, and well below the height limit. He grabbed a ruler from his kitchen drawer and measured random spots across the yard. The tallest blade he could find was 2.2 inches. The second notice arrived at noon. improper storage of refuse containers, garbage and recycling bins visible from street view outside of designated collection periods. Marcus looked at his bins, which were tucked neatly behind his front steps, completely hidden from the street. He took photographs from every angle, documenting that the bins were invisible unless someone trespassed onto his property to look for them. The third notice came at 4 p.m., violation of architectural guidelines. Exterior house numbers not in compliance with approved font and sizing. Specifications. Marcus stared at the brass numbers on his front door, the same numbers that had been there for 20 years. Through his grandmother's entire tenure in the house, he pulled out his HOA documents and found the approved specifications, brass or bronze numbers 4 to 6 inches in height, serif or sans serif fonts. His numbers were brass, 5 inches tall, and had been approved by the Architectural Review Committee decades ago. Karen wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was manufacturing violations out of thin air. By the end of the week, Marcus had received 12 separate violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. His doormat was the wrong size. His garden hose was coiled incorrectly. His mailbox flag was positioned at an inappropriate angle. Each notice carried the same threat: immediate compliance or daily fines starting at $50. Marcus fought back with documentation, photographs, and reasoned responses to each violation. He proved that his grass was within regulation height, that his bins were properly stored, that his house numbers had been approved decades ago. But Karen had learned something important about bureaucratic warfare. The process was the punishment. Even when violations were overturned on appeal, the time and stress of fighting them was exhausting. Marcus spent hours photographing his property, measuring trivial details, and drafting responses to increasingly ridiculous claims. He was being death by thousand paper cuts, and Karen was clearly enjoying every moment of it. The breaking point came on Thursday evening. Marcus was in his kitchen, making dinner and trying to ignore the latest violation, noticed something about his porch light being excessively bright and creating light pollution when he heard a commotion outside. Through his window, he could see Karen standing in her driveway, gesturing animatedly at 2 men in suits. One was taking notes, while the other examined Marcus's house with the focused attention of a building inspector. Marcus grabbed his phone and stepped outside, keeping his distance but staying within earshot. As you can see, Karen was saying, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she used in HOA meetings, the property has been in continuous violation of community standards since the current owner took possession. The previous owner maintained the property beautifully, but this new resident has shown a complete disregard for our neighborhood's character. The man with the notebook nodded. And you believe these violations constitute a public nuisance? Absolutely. The property values of surrounding homes have been negatively impacted by his refusal to maintain basic standards. We've documented over 20 separate violations in the past 2 weeks alone. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising. Karen was talking to what appeared to be city officials, building a case against him using her manufactured violations as evidence. What about the environmental contamination on your property, Mrs. Whitmore? The second man's voice was calm but pointed. Our records show significant fines and ongoing remediation requirements. Karen's composure cracked slightly. That was a minor mechanical issue that's been completely resolved. The important thing is that we maintain community standards for all residents, not just the ones who can afford proper vehicle maintenance. The dig was aimed directly at Marcus, and it hit its mark. She was using his financial situation, his need to keep an older car, his inability to afford a newer house in a different neighborhood, as ammunition in her war against him. That night, Marcus called his friend Jake, a lawyer who'd gone to college with him and now practiced municipal law in the city. Marcus, what you're describing sounds like harassment, Jake said after listening to the full story. HOA boards have broad authority, but they can't manufacture violations or target specific residents for persecution. How do I prove that's what she's doing? Documentation. Everything you've been doing is good, but you need to show a pattern of selective enforcement. Are other residents being cited for similar violations? Marcus thought about it. Karen's own lawn was always perfect, but what about the rest of the neighborhood? I don't think so. She seems to be focusing entirely on me. That's actionable discrimination. Keep documenting everything, and I'll look into filing a civil rights complaint. In the meantime, you might want to consider going on the offensive." "What do you mean?" Jake's voice carried a hint of mischief. "Karen Whitmore isn't the only one who can file complaints. Marcus, if she's violating any rules herself, you have every right to report it." After hanging up, Marcus spent the evening walking through Maple Grove Estates with his camera, documenting every property with the same obsessive attention to detail that Karen had used on his house. What he found was a neighborhood full of minor violations that had been ignored for years because the residents weren't on Karen's enemy list. The Hendersons at 251 had outdoor Christmas decorations still up from the previous year. The Patels at 239 had a decorative garden fence that exceeded the approved height limit. The Johnsons, the ones who'd moved away to escape Karen's harassment, been replaced by new owners who'd painted their front door a shade of blue that wasn't on the approved color palette. But most interesting of all was Karen's own property. Her Range Rover was back in the driveway, parked over a fresh patch of asphalt, where the contaminated area had been remediated. But Karen had made a crucial error in her rush to restore her property's perfect appearance. She'd had the driveway repaved without architectural approval. Section 3.2 of the HOA covenants was explicit. Any modification to exterior surfaces, including driveways, walkways, or parking areas, requires written approval from the Architectural Review Committee prior to commencement of work. Karen had been so focused on eliminating the evidence of her environmental violation that she'd violated the very rules she'd used to terrorize her neighbors for years. Marcus filed his complaint on Friday morning, complete with photographs showing the clear difference between the new asphalt and the existing driveway surface. He cited the exact covenant section, included measurements of the repaved area, and requested immediate enforcement action. The response came faster than he'd expected. At Sawusendan, Karan's phone rang. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see her pacing in her kitchen, her gestures becoming increasingly agitated as the call progressed. 20 minutes later, she appeared at his front door. Karen looked different than she had in previous confrontations. Gone was the controlled confidence, the clipboard, and official demeanor. She stood on his porch in jeans and a wrinkled blouse, her hair slightly disheveled, looking like a woman who'd spent the day fighting fires she couldn't contain. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. Marcus considered closing the door. In her face, but curiosity won out. About what? About calling a truce. The word hung in the air between them like a surrender flag. Marcus had never heard Karen Whitmore admit defeat, and he wasn't sure he was hearing it now. "A truce," he repeated. Karen's jaw tightened, but she pressed on. "This has gotten out of hand. We're both spending time and money on petty disputes that aren't helping anyone. Maybe we should focus on being good neighbors instead of enemies." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of